sea on the channels before the sea rose, and in fact if you look at the pygmy mammoth and a human, I mean, they probably stood no taller than a pony. And of course, the reason why they were so small is because on islands that were separated from the mainland, as it has been shown throughout evolution, and that large animals on islands don't have enough food to support them. So they adapt, and over the generations they become smaller and smaller until they basically become pocket-sized versions of their mainland relatives. But I mean, no one's entirely sure how the pygmy mammoths died out. I mean, it might have been climate change, where a lot of their habitat disappeared, or it could have been when humans arrived on the islands. These mammoths had no defence against any predator because they had no predators. But it could have also been it might have been that some of them might have been forced to inbreed, and that might have caused a lot of genetic problems and health issues. But the truth is, we may never know, but pygmy mammoths are another sign of evolution that Charles Darwin figured out, and that nature always finds a way. And it's always amazing to me to think that these mammoths are shrunk from 10 tons to probably about 3 or 2 tons in about 1,000 years' time. And these are the Channel Islands that the pygmy mammoths were found on. And of course, these are the mammoths. There's the woolly mammoth, Columbian mammoth, there's also other mammoths. And right here is the pygmy mammoth. So as you can see, the pygmy mammoth was absolutely tiny. Now for one of the top predators of the Ice Ages, the cave lion. Now, cave lions were a special kind of big cat that lived in Europe, Siberia and Asia and North America during the Ice Ages, and they were formidable predators. In fact, a fully grown adult was probably about the same size and weight as a Bengal tiger, but they had canine teeth as long as my thumb, and like modern lions and other modern big cats, they could take on prey bigger than themselves. Of course, traces in the fossils have shown that their main prey were reindeer and bison, which are around today, but they might have also hunted musk oxen, another animal that's around today, as well as Saiga antelope, and as I said, another animal that's around today. But they would have also probably hunted mammoth calves, young woolly rhinos, and even that they might have even gone after early humans. And of course, like their name suggests, they did live in caves, and that's probably what caused their extinction when humans came along. They competed with lions for the best caves, but also it might have also been when the Ice Age ended, a lot of their prey disappeared and they couldn't hunt small prey, and that probably led to their extinction. And here is their range. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is this, the Elasmotherium, also known as the woolly rhino. Now, this was one of the biggest rhinos. In fact, it was twice the size of a modern rhino, weighed about 8 tons, and of course it had two large horns, but this one at the front was about as long as I am tall, nearly 2 meters. And like all rhinos, they had very poor vision, but a very, very keen sense of smell and hearing, and would have charged at anything that surprised them. Of course, they lived on open grassland where they would have fed on Ice Age plants and as well Ice Age grass and shrubs and trees. Of course, it's quite possible that, like modern rhinos, males would have fought each other for territory and breeding rights, but also they might have even been able to fight predators like saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, cave lions. They might have even taken on humans like Neanderthals. Of course, when this animal was discovered, people immediately thought it was some kind of animal like a unicorn, but they did find out that this is actually an animal that was alive during the Ice Ages. Of course, no one's completely sure how the woolly rhino died out. I mean, it might have been at the end of the Ice Age, where its habitat disappeared after the climate got warmer, and they might have, like the woolly mammoths, they might have tried to settle in Siberia in northern Russia, but they just weren't able to adapt. Here is their range, and according to all my research, the last surviving woolly rhinos were found around here in Siberia, along with the last surviving mammoths. And the next animal of the Ice Age I'm going to show you is this, the cave bear. Now, cave bears, as their names suggest, they lived in caves, but they stood over 10 feet tall, or around about 10 feet tall, so about as high as a polar bear, weighed about 3/4 of a ton, and they were said to be more muscular than any other bear. So as you can see here, they stood way taller than a fully grown human, and they had formidable teeth. But fossil evidence has shown that these weren't purely carnivorous bears. In fact, most of what they fed on was berries and early spring vegetation, so a lot like American black bears, they weren't very carnivorous. They ate pretty much anything. But of course, they also lived in caves, but that might have been what led to their downfall, because when the Ice Age ended and the climate changed, a lot of the berries that they fed on would have disappeared, and of course they would have also competed with humans for the best caves. It might have also been possible that some cave bears wouldn't have been able to get the right amount of food that they needed and might have died in hibernation. But also it might have been the fact that they might have either refused to or been unable to adapt to their diet, and that probably also led to their downfall. Truth is, we might never really know. This was the range of cave bears that I know of. Now, the final animal I'm going to show you is probably the most famous example of extinction by human beings. It is the dodo. Now, the dodo was a large flightless bird that lived on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, where it was endemic, which means it was found there and nowhere else on Earth. And it's almost certainly the first species, the first animal species that human beings deliberately exterminated in historic times. And the dodo is quite often portrayed as a short, squat, dumpy bird that was also very, very stupid. But actually, that is a very unfair observation. The dodo was not actually stupid, it was more trusting because it had no natural predators and it wasn't. And it was more curious because it had never seen human beings before. And of course, one of the reasons why the dodo is always portrayed like that is because of this painting by a Dutch artist in the 17th century called Roland Saver. But he had never seen a dodo and based his accounts from seafarers. Of course, this one is found in the Natural History Museum in London, but unfortunately, this one is also a fake. The feathers come from a goose, the feet were modelled on a turkey, and its beak is quite possibly made of plaster. Although the museum can be forgiven because not many specimens of the dodo remain. In fact, the dodo was discovered by Dutch sailors in the 17th century, well, the 1600s. And of course, for a while, the dodo was hunted for food, but dodo has been said to have been actually quite disgusting meat. But the Dutch sailors brought with them rats, foxes, cats, dogs, badgers and weasels. And of course, the dodos nested on the ground because they were flightless, but they also had they had no natural predators and no ways to defend themselves. And of course, the rats plundered their nests and ate their eggs. And of course, but they might have also eaten their chicks, as well as the foxes, the badgers, the weasels, the cats, and the dogs would have eaten the adult dodos, and in less than 100 years after their discovery, the dodo just completely disappeared. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the dodo is always portrayed as a short, squat and dumpy creature, mainly because of this painting by Roland Savo, the 17th century Dutch artist. But as I mentioned, he'd never seen a dodo and based his painting on accounts from seafarers. But this is the skeleton of a dodo, and of course, from studying it, like for instance, where its legs join its pelvis, we actually know that the bird stood more upright, but also its feathers were probably a lot fluffier than that painting. And we also now know that the dodo was closely related to the pigeon, and it probably gave a pigeon-like call, like a sort of goo-goo, 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 and that gave the bird its name. And of course, it might have had a very large egg, but probably no bigger than my hand. But of course, as many people say, the dodo was a very stupid bird. It actually wasn't that stupid. It was more trusting because the dodo had never seen human beings before, and it had no predators on the island of Mauritius. But this is probably the most famous example of human beings exterminating animals either deliberately or accidentally. And that here is the island of Mauritius, where the dodo was found. It was just to the east of Madagascar. And of course, there are talks about bringing the dodo back, but as I said, with the Moas, I've got mixed feelings about that, but that's a debate for another day. Well, that has been my remastering of my PowerPoint presentation on extinct animals that I find the most fascinating. As I said, I've got one more PowerPoint to remaster after this one, and then I'm done remastering my PowerPoints. So But do check those out as well.